being cognizant of who our kids are and what their social and emotional needs are is really important. And while a child developmentally may seem like they could handle something, it's still like that's where the personality framework overlaid on that is so significant, because it gives us the information that we need about how do we really connect with our kids. Because in the end, these conversations that we're having with them is about connection and about helping them to feel safe and secure and resilient in a world that's ever changing.
Welcome to Real Talk with the Parenting Blueprint Coaches, where we discuss all aspects of parenting using the foundation of understanding personality dynamics to raise independent, responsible, and resilient children. My name is Karen Wagner, founder of Teaching Our Youth and the Parenting Blueprint. Let's dig right in with today's topic and have some real talk with the Parenting Blueprint Coaches.
Greetings to everybody. We're so glad you found us. This is Janet Krebs, joined with
Mindy Green.
And we are part of the Parenting Blueprint Coaches, talking to you tonight about a very important topic. But before we dive in, I do want to remind everybody, we are a collaboration. There are other coaches, I promise you, and they are going to show themselves live one of these evenings, but schedules do, as you all know, we are all parents and things come up, priorities shift. And so you get to have Mindy and myself as your hosts, but I promise one of these days you are going to meet Karen again here in a different studio than you know her. And you're going to get to meet Roseanne, and you're going to love them in these kinds of talks. So that is my promise to you. We won't belabor that any further, because Mindy and I are excited to talk with you tonight about what I think is a very important topic. And it's anchored in one of my favorite topics, and really the center from where I approach parenting, which is leadership. And did you know that one of the key characteristics of a great leader is being able to have difficult conversations? Now, you might be thinking, well, Janet, I do that every day with my kids because I've got inquisitive kids, or my kids ask lots of questions and blah, 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 blah. Yes. That's because you are a leader. As a parent, we are all leaders. And so tonight, let us just dive into that a little bit further and focus on how, maybe some strategies and some tactics on how we can actually have these tough conversations with our kids. And I'll lob it over to Mindy, since I think I gave us an intro.
Yes, thank you, Janet. And as Janet had said, I think that we all are accustomed to being asked awkward questions sometimes with our kids, and they catch us at those times when maybe we're making dinner or we're in the car, we're in the midst of something, and then it catches our attention. And I think we live in a world when there are so many different issues that are coming up, and really sometimes not knowing exactly how to approach it. And I'll give a quick example. I asked my daughter if it was okay to share this. And the other day, her 8-year-old son caught her when she was making dinner, and he said, "May I talk to you?" Wow. And so she thought that he was wanting to talk to her about something his brother did. And so she said, sure. So she turned off the stove real quick, and she went into his room, and he wanted to know what puberty was. Oh. So, yes. And so she was like,
"While I'm making the rice, let me just, we've got 12 minutes before the rice is ready, but let's see what we can do, dear."
Exactly. And so she was just trying to figure out, how does she go about approaching that? How much was appropriate to really talk about with him? And so I thought she did a really good job because she was asking questions of, kind of what his understanding of things was. And so that's partly what we're going to be talking about tonight. And we have it structured so that we can talk about it from those difficult things that come up in the world, those global events. And we all know that there are situations that come up because we're bombarded by it, right? We have 24/7 news, and we're more connected in some ways than ever to people all over the world. So we know when there are things going on that are difficult, and we know when there are things going on locally as well. So that's kind of our framework. Jan and I prepared for this. We thought it would be good to go over how to discuss those global topics as well as those local events that come up. And I have a couple of examples of that just recently in my own area of the country, and then also personal. So with that, I will go ahead and kick it off.
I have a question before you launch in, though. How old was, I guess this is your nephew, right? How old?
Oh, my grandson. He's 8. Grandson. Yeah, he's 8.
8.
Yes. And the reason why he brought it up was because he heard his teacher talking about it with another teacher. And I think he just heard the word and he didn't know what it meant. And so it had been percolating all day until, of course, dinner time.
Very interesting.
Yes.
8.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little out of touch. I don't wow. Good for her.
Yes.
Even more than the rice preparation time, or
well,
what do you tell an 8-year-old about what that's interesting.
Yeah, and that's why I think that she was like, oh boy, and I think I'm in my head, I'm thinking, the March of Doom, dun 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 dun, going to the room, and then with her 6-year-old son, my 6-year-old grandson, later on he popped his head into the room. He's like, I'm scared out here. Because he was out in the living room by himself and he just wanted to know what was going on.
Wow. I should probably crack open my memory brain and remember what those conversations were like, because it's been more than a minute since I've had them. So thank you for that reminder. And for anybody else that is facing that, I guess 8 is a new threshold. But kids don't go through puberty until when now?
Well, I think that it's probably around 10-ish. And so I know for my daughter, one of the things she had said was like, oh, I thought I had more time. So then we got, obviously we went on Amazon and we started looking at books to talk about puberty, and and the way that she handled it was just those changes in your body, the things that he might start to see, even with some of his friends who are in older grades in elementary school. So I think she did a really good job, and I was really, really impressed.
I actually think it's really funny that while we were talking about either that, like when we were talking about this topic, those kinds of subjects never came up for us. And yet, so we're kind of going in reverse, right? Mm-hmm. So we thought we were going to go global, local, and personal. Here is a beautiful explanation of some personal tough topics that you may have with your kids, and you don't have to start them, they do. That's right. That's beautiful.
Right. It's responding to what's coming up. And we did have someone ask, what is the topic? And really the topic is, I started it out by just sharing the story about puberty, but it's really about how we handle any tough topic with our kids, and it can be, in this situation, something that our kids bring to us. It could be local events that happen, those tragedies that happen, global events that capture their attention. So it's more of a generalized topic, but I brought it to puberty to answer your question about what the topic is.
However, but this is actually, we can very easily just we just do it in reverse. Lean back to the framework. Mm-hmm. You said some very key things. Asked the questions back, right? So mm-hmm. It's not necessarily just us teaching or, delivering content, asking good questions. Like that's how she found out that he overheard a teacher's talking, right? Who is your child? what is their temperament? We work a lot with the DISC as an assessment. So if you've got a very cautious child, feeling like sharing with them that their bodies are going to change might not be the best response, because they may then have some very just distorted, simply because of maturity, distorted, like, what does that even mean, right? Like, they're not thinking necessarily that their voice is just going to deepen. They might be telling themselves a different story. Or you've got, a different kid, your high D kids that may then need to learn that, internalize it, and then go to school the next day and say, hey guys, did you know that when we go through puberty, this, and this is going to happen, right? So this would be a great time to really understand the profile is too strict of a word, just the overall temperament of your child. Of course, we're always going to endorse doing a formal assessment like DISC, but just having a general idea of the temperament of your child before you dive into an answer like that.
Absolutely. And I can say for my grandson that he is he's a high S. So he's that supportive personality, and he really needs to have those, to feel he's connected by those conversations that he has. So he's the one who will sit and snuggle with you, and, and then he's like peppering you with questions.
Right.
So I think it's important, like you said, Janet, to have an awareness of what our child's temperament is. How do we meet those emotional needs that they have when these things come up, whether it's in a personal conversation or as we get into some of the other things as well. And so that's having that awareness of your child and what their needs are.
Yeah. I was really impressed when you started the story that she turned off the stove and they walked, the walk into the bedroom, right? Ba-dum, ba-dum, like, right. That was like, and she didn't even know it was happening, but she knows her child and knows that he needed to have her full attention and to be attended to. That would not have been, I would have been like, my kids didn't need that. It would be like, sure, what do you want to know? Just while I'm still cooking. So that's interesting. Again, know your kids. So
exactly.
Great. That's a great illustration, actually. But
yeah.
I was not thinking about puberty.
And she was not either.
I'm kind of glad I don't have to go through that again. Those days are long gone. Let the kids do it with their own kids now. Okay, moving on. Should we stay personal or should we map out a little bit? Let's go local. We just go we're just go the other direction.
Yeah, we'll go the other way. So as I guess I'm part of the storytelling here, and I know that you also have a story to share with this, Janet. I was thinking about local the other day as I was prepping for this, and Janet and I were having a conversation about like what are we going to talk about. And so this was just around the time last week or the week before when the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore was hit and came crashing down. And so that was something that was really in the headlines here. And I also had lived in Baltimore for 3 years, so I felt like that was a little bit of my former territory. And I felt that very personally, and the impact that it has not only on the people that I know and care about, but the local economy here. And, that's going to have a ripple effect, throughout the country as well. So, and I again, with my grandsons, they were here and, they heard their mom talking to me a little bit about it. And so they wanted to know what happened. And so this is another area where we had to think about, what do we want to share? Because we don't want them to be concerned, because I don't know about where you all live, but here we're surrounded by bridges. There's lots of water, there are rivers, there are lakes. I mean, it's everywhere. We have the Chesapeake Bay. So we're going over water all the time. And so we wanted to give them a little bit of an understanding of what was happening, at the same time, helping them to be aware that, this is very unusual. And this did not happen right here. But that it happened a little further away.
So what does that look like?
So, with an 8-year-old and a 6-year-old, they have lots of questions. My older grandson more so than my younger grandson, because he's like, you can just give him like, oh, a bridge fell down. And he's like, okay. And he's off to play.
Whatever.
Yes. And so for my older grandson though, and he's thinks a lot about this. Again, he's a high S. And so he was wondering, well, were there people on the
Tell
bridge?
everybody what a high S is.
Okay, so high S is that supportive personality. They're really, can't we all just get along type of people. They're really interested in the connections and bonding with those who are close to them. And so that was important to him to be able to talk about that. And he was concerned, were there other people on the bridge? Were they able to stop traffic? What time of day did this happen? What are they doing now? And so, so we talked about a little bit about that yes, there were some people that were on the bridge and some of them have been rescued. We didn't go into the nitty-gritty details of that, but he wanted to know that. And he also wanted to know, well, what are they doing with the bridge now? And I said, well, it's completely collapsed. So and I did show him a picture of some of the big equipment that they brought in to haul these huge pieces of steel out of the bay so that they can get traffic going again, the boat traffic.
It's so interesting. Yeah, it's just so interesting because every area, first of all, I'm very envious. You have all that water. I'm completely landlocked here in Indiana, so congratulations. I won't hold that against you because I care about you too much. But yeah, you see it, you could take them to the site and you could drive them to it. Like they can actually visually, all kids, not even just your grandkids, but all kids, the questions must be so robust. And there's a part of me that says, especially for like 8, that kind of tweenish, it's good. It's interesting for them to understand that, goods and services in your area move by boat and that, they can understand supply chain and things like that. And then they have a different appreciation for going to the grocery store with you because they're like, oh, well, maybe this came by boat or maybe it came by train. But I know they don't think about where do goods come from? How do they get to the stores? So it's a cool conversation for them to start expanding their world a little bit without feeling weighed down by the gravity of the impact, right? I mean, obviously it's impactful for your area, but for anybody that doesn't have to drive by it, it might be just this is what happens with the world. This is how goods are transported either here or locally or to, other countries. And that's how we responsibly begin to share the patterns of a global society. So there are some pros to it, I guess, but we also just have to be very mindful. And my favorite word, the intentional word, when we are intentional with our language and our questioning, then we're going to make good progress. It's funny when you were talking, I was thinking, we had talked about my son he was like homeless obsessed when he was younger. He would we would pass somebody, he would cry. But for the topic of tonight, and I hope I don't offend anybody by saying this, thinking locally, in our small community, a number of years ago, we had a coffee shop that opened up and it was called Badass Coffee. And it was wonderful. And it was a great hangout. And it was, they played music and anything and everything. But the sign on a major road said Badass Coffee. And I remember my kids asking about that. I had no idea, but we looked it up. That was anchored in a fable of how donkeys, which were the bad asses, would go and go get the coffee beans and bring them back. And that's what they were called. It wasn't derogatory. Our society made it kind of slang and potentially inappropriate or offensive for certain residents. I didn't know what to say to my kid, but then we looked it up. And I asked him, I was like, it doesn't offend me. Does it offend you? He was like, no, it really doesn't. And then we found out that it was a fable. And then he was that kid that had to explain the fable to everybody the next day at school. However, isn't it funny how just asking the right questions and learning totally dispelled any slang or derogatory, inappropriate language that may have been on a sign on a local road. And just as an aside, enough people did petition for it to come down, put them out of business, which was kind of sad because that wasn't the intent, but it's just a beautiful language, a beautiful example rather of having a tough conversation with a kid. I didn't know what to say. I mean, that it didn't offend me personally, but he wanted to know what was the big deal.
I think, that's such a great story because I think that that's what happens oftentimes when we take something on the surface as well. And so, and that really depending on the age of our child as well, right? How deep do we dive? And with that, it made for an interesting conversation with you and it was Ben, right?
Yep.
So that you all could do a little bit of research and find out what was behind it. And so I think that that's the golden opportunity, isn't it? Whenever we have these conversations, these heart-to-heart conversations, is to really have a better understanding as well of how our kids are thinking and how they're responding to things, what they're taking in. And that's really knowing your child. And as we've been talking a little bit tonight about the DISC model of human behavior, that's really, it gives us a great framework to work from in recognizing what their needs are. Because, Ben you were able to do that research and figure out, this was something that was really helpful for him to have that knowledge. And just like what you're talking about, like with the goods and services, how it gets to, from wherever it's grown to our, to the grocery store and then to our homes. I was just thinking about the ship that had run into the Key Bridge in Baltimore. That actually was one that was going to Singapore.
Right.
And so that was a great conversation that we ended up having when I was talking to my grandson about it, because we mapped out like, well, where is Baltimore? And then it was going to go down and go through the Panama Canal, which is a whole conversation in and of itself. And then it was going to go out into the Pacific, and where would it go from there? So those were, really great learning opportunities. And the focus was a little bit different, right? Than it might be if we had a teenager who was asking more questions, because I know in that particular incident that they were talking about, is this an act of terrorism? So then, that
Did they really ask that?
Some have, yes. And some of the pundits who have been talking about it on the news have said, that was one of the first things they wondered, was this a terrorist attack, especially because it was flying a foreign flag. So I was just thinking about where the conversation might go if you had a teenager as well.
Yeah. And so there's actually another point, is when tackling a tough conversation with our kids, two things come to mind. Remove our own subjective ideas about what we think, because number two, we may not have enough information. Mm-hmm. And so if we start speculating and telling stories about events, and this will be also applicable when we talk about global, if we don't have enough information, we are perpetuating the storytelling, and we're not doing anybody, in my opinion, justification of a good communication, a good style of learning and problem solving and just having a good discussion. That to me is not healthy leadership communication. That's storytelling and influencing without the right information. And so I understand that was a strong statement, but that's part of I believe that's part of our responsibility, is getting the correct information so that we are at least telling an accurate story. And then our job is to let them decide or ask better questions or decide what they take from it. But if nobody has all the information, then we're just storytelling.
Absolutely. I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think so often we feel like, and this is some of that self-awareness for ourselves, what is it that is driving us in sharing what it is that we share? Is it storytelling? Is it passing on misinformation maybe, or it could be accurate, whatever it is. But I think that that's where it's important to be able to tune into our kids and what is it that they're curious about? What is it that they're asking? And, it's okay, and I have to remind myself of this, because even now, like as my kids are adults and they come to me with questions and I'm like, I have no idea.
And that's okay to say.
Yes, exactly. It's okay. We don't have to have all of the answers, and our kids don't expect us to. And I think that when we can show them that we can be okay, that we are safe, that we are whatever those words are, that we can process things and go through whatever emotions there are, whether it's something personal that's going on for, in our lives, or if it's something that's happened locally, that we are okay. And, that we have feelings about it, because we're helping them to be able to, we're modeling for them. How do you go through that process of handling something like this, that resilience that comes with it, and having the emotions that go along with whatever has happened.
Yeah. And it just reminded me of something else before we get big picture again, kind of going back personal and maybe even local, death, a very difficult discussion. When we see people that are less than abled or in wheelchairs, visually handicapped, and I don't know if that's politically correct. However, we want to encourage our kids to ask the right questions to us so that they understand. We never want to stifle that, right? And that, because that's them understanding the world. People die. People are in wheelchairs. People need seeing eye dogs. People need people need lots of different things. And we always want to encourage them to ask questions. And so I guess there is kind of that delicate balance too, because thank God we forgive kids, sometimes they say the darndest things, and giving them vocabulary at some point to offer them some vocabulary that is tasteful and tactful so that they could ask either us or other people about things, how they're feeling. You don't want to discourage that.
Right. I'm laughing because I was just thinking of my youngest son, and he is, since we're speaking about DISC, he is an I, which is inspiring. And so and I sometimes think of the I as also being somewhat impulsive. I have this in me as well. It's one of my personality traits. And for him, it's very, very strong. And so I remember he had said something to my mother-in-law, and she's a little on the heavier side. And so he had said something about being fat. And so then she'd had this nice conversation with him, though she handled it really well. And she had said, we don't call people fat, they may be heavier, or we might say, sometimes you can say maybe a nicer word. And this is what he really grasped onto, is chunky. And so one day he took that then, because he had that conversation with her, and then he was patting my sister's arm one day. And he told her, he's like, oh, he said, you have a nice chunky arm. And he said, by chunky, I mean fat. And so that's one of those moments you're like, oh, a little more discussion here.
And that's a whole other discussion about how some words trigger people and some words don't. And that's a whole other discussion. So, but yeah, I don't know why I just thought about that. So yeah, moving on.
Yes, definitely. So I know that there are also things happening all over the world, and some of those capture our attention more because perhaps they're covered a bit more in our news, or it might impact someone in our family. And a couple of examples of this have been like the war in Ukraine, and as well as I know that what's been going on in Israel, like Palestine, like the Gaza Strip. Those are things that are very much in the forefront of our news and the things that we hear on a regular basis. So that's why we also want to talk a little bit about global. How do you bring up those topics with your kids?
And I think a great place to start for that, in addition, so now we have to add a layer to knowing your kids, their personality styles, is age appropriateness. Mm-hmm. Especially when it's a world event. Really, at some point, it's pointless to overuse that word. It's pointless to describe to a young child what's happening clear across the globe. They can't even fathom going across the state lines and entering in another state, let alone a continent across an ocean. And so I think age, and maybe not age, maybe I shouldn't say that so emphatically, maturity, which often comes with age. However, what is actually the emotional maturation age of that child? And like, are they readers? If you don't have a reader, if you've got a child that still loves cartoons, they don't care. And I don't know that they need to. It's not necessarily like, this is a great time to ask the question, what is the value of sharing this information with my child? And do they need to know? Because they only have room for so much. And the world is already scary, both personally and locally. So I think I would draw a hard line with being discriminating. I'm not going to say don't, but be very discriminating about how far out you feel the need to share information. And you might have a different take for an older group of kids.
So I think it's really also what they're being exposed to, right? Because just like with my 8-year-old grandson, who knew that he was going to hear the word puberty and pick up on that. And so, I think that if it's something that they might be hearing about in schools, and I'm thinking about right now, especially with Israel and what's going on with the Gaza Strip, that might be something that they might be hearing even like in their synagogues, in the prayers and things like that. That might be something that they're picking up on. And I wonder too, in that case, is it, to give us some consideration then to what is it that they really want to know, first of all, and that's where that conversation comes into play, and listen to what are they asking, and what are they curious about, and then go from there. And for our older kids,
I was just going to say, before you move to older, a great, and how are they getting the information?
Right.
Because that reminded me, and I live in a predominantly Christian area. I live in Middle America, and it is God's country. Thank God. It is God's country. And there are no synagogues around at all. And I was driving to a neighboring town on a semi-major thoroughfare. And I saw 2 Israeli flags. Never before in my life. I used to commute that back when I was a teacher. Mm-hmm. So these were new. And listening to you talk right then reminded me, if I had had a young child in my car and they asked, why does that house have a Jewish star on a flag hanging outside? Bam, there's a beautiful opportunity to explain that there might be some unrest or that people are angry with each other. Find the language or the vocabulary, age appropriate. But I don't know that I would offer, hey, by the way, at dinner time, right? Hey, by the way, you should know. That's not appropriate. But if they picked up on a symbol that they inquired about, i.e. the flag, then there's a perfect opportunity to share information. So maybe the sourcing of information, if it organically unfolds, there's our opportunity to share information, not necessarily the, hey, you should know this, you should know this, you should know this. Just let it happen. If it happens organically, then that's a great teaching moment. Sorry to interrupt you, but that just triggered that. And it was I thought it was a timely example.
Absolutely. And I think that that was an important add, because I think, as you said, like the source of it, it's really, and this is where I think allowing them to lead, and what their questions are. And that way it takes away some of the angst on us as well, because we don't have to explain every single thing that's been going on, the history there, and, for my kids, when they were teens and there were things that were going on in the Middle East, one of the things that we would talk about is, we would tie that back into some of the things that biblically, even, some history there. So as the teacher, as a homeschool mom, I was always throwing in some history just so that there would be some context as well as to, some of those long-standing animosities or whatever it is. But again, allowing them to lead in what it is that they were wondering about, because we know that fear has such a huge impact on us. And I know that I don't want my kids to live in fear. I don't want my grandkids to live in fear, or any of our kids.
Well, I think 9/11 gave us a heavy dose of what it was like for us all to learn language and to assuage our own fears and be very cognizant of how we were explaining that to the members of our family and how we all dealt with it and the conversations. That was unfortunately a great test for us all in exactly this topic. May we never have to go through that again. And yet it was a preemptive lesson in exactly what we're talking about.
Right. And I think that kind of piggybacking on that too, I was just thinking about the pandemic, and that there are, just now even we're starting to see and just the very beginnings of what does that look like for our kids, for our families going forward. And we talk about getting back to normal, but things aren't normal. And I know this sounds trite, and it is a new normal. There are things that have forever changed in the way that we handle things on a day-to-day basis, and and some of the policies that we see. So these are all, again, listening to what our kids are asking and some of those questions, that gives us an opportunity to delve into a little bit of it, at least, depending on what their age level is, their maturity, and recognizing, again, too, like you had said, why are we sharing what we are sharing? Is this something that is important to me, and is that something that really needs to be shared with my kid, or is this something that I can have a conversation with another adult about? Because I think that that's important to recognize that as well.
Right. So I guess if we were to sum up, being responsive to good questions, giving ourselves permission, keep track for me here, because I'm just giving ourselves permission to not have all the answers and use that as a teachable moment, if age appropriate, to explore further. We certainly all have handheld devices that we can get information at, drop of a hat. So there's two things. And then understanding who your child is from a maturation and personality perspective, so that what we are sharing is in alignment with what they're going to hear.
Yes, very well said. I agree.
And that's really for all levels. That goes for young children, for teens, tweens, and for, a young adult that might either still be living with you or is just moving out, or at college is a great, they still need to feel very, very safe. So that three-pronged criteria might be applicable to all levels and to all kids. So it's just something important to keep in mind.
Absolutely. I think you framed it well.
And to remember, because now I'm going to get on my soapbox for a second, we are all the leaders. And so even a good leader is able and willing to have the tough conversations, but an exemplary leader is one that is always willing to say, I'm not really sure about that, but let's find out.
Mm-hmm.
And we are all of that. We are all leaders, and we have the capability to do all of that. That's our responsibility as parents.
Absolutely. And I'll follow that up too with just from my neuroscience background as well, and just thinking about it from a brain health perspective, from that mental well-being, and being cognizant of who our kids are and what their social and emotional needs are is really important. And while a child developmentally may seem like they could handle something, it's still like that's where again the personality framework overlaid on that is so significant, because it gives us the information that we need about how do we really connect with our kids, because in the end these conversations that we're having with them is about connection and about helping them to feel safe and secure and resilient in a world that's ever changing.
Amen, sister. Amen. Beautifully said.
All right.
Out? You want to close them out? You want to say goodbye, Gracie?
Sure. So we just wanted to say thank you again from Janet and I for joining us. And if you have questions, please feel welcome to reach out in the group, in Karen's group, which is Parent by Design. You can find any one of us here. Janet's there. I'm also part of it. Roseanne is, and Karen, of course, is monitoring things. So if this brings up questions for you, please feel welcome to leave them around this video, or you can make a separate post. And we are always there to have these conversations with you about how to tackle these tough topics with your kids.